All right, so that's Plutarch. The final source I'm going to talk about is Suetonius. So Suetonius he was born 55 years after the death of Augustus, but he's a little more contemporary with the period of Augustus. He could actually talk to people that were, alive during the reign of Augustus. He was a clerk. He was an imperial secretary, so he had access to, the imperial archives. So he had like all this really good source material to work with. He had personal letters that Augustus had written to Livy, our first historian that we talked about. They were good buddies. So he's got some really good things going for him for why he's a good source. Now why he's a bad source, he was kind of like a gossip monger. He's like the TMZ of the Roman era. He loved scandal and gossipy stories that he heard, and he didn't really critically assess the validity of these stories, whether they were true or not. So he just kind of like provided them in his histories as if they were fact. So that's kind of one of the things that makes him a bad source. And these are just some gossipy snippets that Suetonius relayed that we don't know if they're true or not, and he doesn't even question the veracity of them. Like he's talking about Tiberius, he says, even as a young officer, he was such a hard drinker that his name, Tiberius Claudius Nero, was displaced by the nickname drinker of hot wine with no water added. So, the wine in this period, you needed to, dilute it with some amount of water. So if you were drinking, the wine like straight without it being diluted any, then you would have been considered a real drunk. So he's calling him, a big drunk, So it's just like these little stories that really have no bearing on the history of the Republic or its administration that he would convey that make his history sometimes a little dubious. All right, so just a little history of Augustus. So we know that he's kind of Julius Caesar's his great uncle. Octavian's father had died pretty young. Caesar apparently takes a liking to Octavian, who later became Augustus, of course. Augustus went to go join Caesar in Africa when he was on campaign despite sickness, and Caesar looked favorably on this kind of conduct. He was in Apollonia studying when he heard of Caesar's murder, and that he was chosen as Caesar's heir, in his will, and it wasn't Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general that maybe most people would have been putting their money on as going to be the successor of Caesar's fortune. So now he's Caesar's adopted son, and he inherits Caesar's vast wealth, and this is what he uses to catapult himself to power. So we have what's called the Second Triumvirate. There's after Caesar's killed, there's the empire falls into civil war. I'm not going to go into all the details, but these guys are all kind of fighting each other at first, but in the end they kind of form a sort of a fragile peace. They become what's called the Second Triumvirate with Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. We have Lepidus who takes control of Africa there, and Octavian gets Europe, Hispania, Gaul, and Italy, and Antony is stationed in the Near East and Egypt. So they kind of split the empire in threes essentially. So this doesn't last too long. Lepidus. So Augustus. The first thing Augustus does, he has to get rid of his rival. So he gets rid of Lepidus first. And, in 36 BC, Lepidus, he tried to absorb Sicily into his territory with North Africa. Sicily is a very grain-rich island and would have been a nice prize for his territory. But so he moves his legions into that area, but the legions defect to Octavian. They obviously weren't big fans of Lepidus, and they end up defecting. And Octavian takes this opportunity to get rid of Lepidus. He takes over his territory. Lepidus is stripped of all of his titles and all these things, except for he lets him stay Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. And so then all that's left now is Octavian versus Mark Antony. So, once he does get rid of Antony, Augustus quickly starts to, consolidate power, and he does a lot of things that make him. Many historians consider him to be the greatest emperor, the period of emperors in Rome, and he's considered widely to be the best. And this is why he expanded the empire to perhaps its greatest extent, besides the reign of Trajan, for a little while. He conquered a lot of territory. He annexed Egypt. Previously, it was just kind of a client kingdom to Rome. He pushed the border of the empire in North and Southern Europe to the Rhine and the Danube. And then he stopped there at the Rhine. And the reason he stopped is the famous battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where one of his generals, Publius Quintilius Varus, he had 3 legions there. He had a scout with him who was a German tribesman who, they crossed the Rhine. They were intending to conquer more land in Germany. They get ambushed. The scout leads them into an ambush, basically, and all 3 legions are just destroyed. Their auxiliary is destroyed. Maybe 20,000 men are killed. This is a really devastating defeat for a Roman military that's not used to such defeats like this. And supposedly Suetonius tells us, that Augustus was so distraught by this massacre, this defeat, that he would just stumble around his palace at night screaming, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. He was very upset. And after that, whether that's true or not, he never did try to reconquer that region beyond the Rhine again. That really did become the border of the empire for centuries afterwards. So that's how he really expanded the borders, but left it there. But he did other ways of conquering, supposedly. He restored eagles. Now we have like the Parthian Empire here. This is the most powerful empire on Rome's edges. And you probably remember from lectures that the Parthians, so Crassus was a member of that first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. And Crassus, he was super rich, and he had all this power, but he didn't really have any military victories. And he really wanted to have that military victory, that badge that merit badge, so to speak, that he could put on his chest. So he gathered an army and set off for Parthia to conquer some land, and he was crushed, by the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. And what happened was he lost the eagles, the standards, these golden animals that would sit atop these pikes that were carried into battle. And losing these standards was a huge embarrassment for the Roman military. So when Augustus came to power a couple decades later, he signed a treaty with Parthia, which allowed them to restore these, for the Parthians to give back the standards that were taken when Crassus was defeated. And it might not sound like a big deal, but you can see, like, this is the famous statue, the Augustus of Prima Porta, that was found in Prima Porta at Livia, his wife's supposed villa. But of all the things that Augustus did in his lifetime, the thing chosen to be memorialized here was the Parthians handing back the standards to a Roman soldier, perhaps maybe supposed to be Augustus himself. And that's like the primary symbolism on that chest plate, indicating how big of a deal this was. So other stuff he did. He started a lot of public works projects. He built a lot of temples. He did, a forum. There were theaters, amphitheaters. He restored a lot of the roads that had gone into disuse. And so he really beautified the city, at a time where it probably would have still been pretty lackluster compared to a lot of cities around the Mediterranean. But besides beautifying the city, which was nice, he was a savvy political operator. Besides beautifying the city, what this also did was, for one, it gave jobs to this urban proletariat that caused such havoc, which caused these civil wars in the first place, making them happy. It also gave building projects to the equites, kind of like this middle class of Roman society, where they were given these big projects. So he's doing something here that makes the urban proletariat, the poor, happy. He's doing something here that makes the equites happy. And a big part of him being able to consolidate power is making sure all aspects of society are behind him. And we'll see that continued in the other things he does. So that's what the public works projects were good for. He also revived religious rights. Like I said, he was kind of a moralizer. He was a religious conservative of sorts for the period. His adopted father, Julius Caesar, he had created the Julian calendar, and he formally adopted that, something that's very close to our current calendar, you can see. I mean, he added himself, Augustus, there for the month of August, as you can guess. He also revived religious rites that had kind of fallen in disuse. He brought back the idea of the Lupercalia. It was like a fertility festival where these men would run around the city naked, whipping women in some sort of, it was supposed to help with fertility issues and stuff like that. He kind of brought this back, but he also, he prohibited young boys from running the Lupercalia. You had to be of a certain age at least to run around whipping people with goat skin, so that was good. He also had a very serious law forbidding adultery, which he was obviously very serious about because he actually banished his own daughter, Julia, on the basis of this law. She was known as being promiscuous and having a number of sexual partners, and he eventually got fed up with this and exiled her using this adultery law. So this kind of shows you his, that he had this kind of idea. He was a religious conservative. He was trying to push these kind of moral values on the Roman state. Okay, so this goes back to, we're still talking about how he consolidated power. A big part of that was reducing the size of the Senate. At this point, it was over 1,000 people in the Senate. It was not uncommon to try to pack the Senate with people that would help you push through legislation you wanted to. So he reduced the size. How did he do it? The first way, he just had the other senators write down the names of each senator, naming each other, and if enough names came up on a piece of paper, then they would be kicked out. That kind of culled the herd down, a couple hundred. And then the final way he did it was by, he and Agrippa just show up on the Senate floor and with a bodyguard and swords and armor on, and are basically have them come up and, like, if they willfully resign, the senator, then they were like, look, if you willfully resign, then you still get to keep all the cool things while being a senator. You would still be allowed to wear your special toga, so everybody knows that you're a senator, or were. You still got, all the best, like, seats for, like, big sporting events at the Hippodrome or at the theaters. And you would also be allowed to still attend, these special senatorial feasts. So you still got all of the trappings of being a senator without any of the power, which probably a lot of these senators were more than happy to oblige that, because that's really what they really cared about. So he reduces the size of the Senate, gets rid of people that maybe would have been opposed to his consolidation in this way. And then, we've talked about how he made the urban proletariat happy, the equites. So keeping the military happy, this is obviously a big thing. We talked about how, you had all these armies that were loyal to their generals, and this kind of led to, he didn't want another Octavian to show up, with a big army and take him down and let this cycle continue. So he wanted to keep the military close. He wanted to centralize control of the army with him. So he did this he put all the legions that were left. The army was so huge at this point. He also, he had inherited Mark Antony's legions. He had so many. He ended up retiring a lot of the people, founding colonies for veterans around the Mediterranean. In this way, making the size a little more manageable. And then he put the active legions in certain provinces around the empire that were the particularly dangerous ones. The ones that still were kind of on the frontiers, where there was barbarian invasions on occasion that were coming in and disrupting stuff. So he put all the legions in those more dangerous provinces, and he took control of those provinces himself. And he gave control of the more cushy provinces to the senators, which obviously kept them happy. Being the governor of Sicily is a really cushy gig for a senator. This is a very Romanized island at this point. It's very wealthy. It has a lot of grain, so you'd get very rich just living on the island of Sicily without having to worry about invasions or leading an army. So the senators think this is great, but for what Augustus was getting out of this is he gets to retain control of all the legions. They're not going to be under the control of any senators. So that's the way that he takes control, consolidates control of the army. He also makes the military happy with these military retirement funds. This essentially creates a professionalized army. After they sign up for 20 years, if they survive that 20 years, then the veterans receive the equivalent of 13 years of pay after completion of their service. So they get a little retirement package that they can look forward to after they finish up, which would curtail them wanting to abandon the army. So in the end, he never, you can see all these ways that he's consolidating power, but he never called himself a lord, or what would have been like a rex in Roman society. He would have perhaps gone by the term princeps, or first among equals, what that would translate to. And the reason for that is because, being called a Rex in Rome will get you killed. Julius Caesar was trying to consolidate power around himself, and he may have pushed it a little too far in making himself out to look like one of these monarchs of old, one of those 7 monarchs that Romans in this period did not look back on fondly. So you would definitely never want to be called a Rex in this period. So in sum, you can see here this sums up Augustus. Public works to make the urban proletariat happy. He expanded a lot of the territory of the empire, reduced the size of the Senate, centralized control of the military around himself. He created these military retirement accounts. He formalized the Julian calendar and brought back all these religious festivals, and he instituted morality laws. And those are some of the main things that we get from Suetonius on the reign of Augustus. I think that's the extent of what I have, and